Welcome everybody to the Janus Film Review podcast. It's
Numero two.
Numero two. It's Dan and Tom here from Janus Film Review. We are back with a discussion of a film which could be potentially quite contentious between the two of us. But it is a film that maybe it's a film that came out on home media not so long ago, and it is written and directed by Stephen Merchant, and it is Fighting With My Family. So this comes with a bit of a caveat, doesn't it, Dan?
In a manner of speaking, as say Tom has, as one should, approached this film as a fan of films, filmmaking, everything related to it, and has watched it and found it very enjoyable. However, my very good self, I bring a little baggage to this particular situation because once upon a time, many moons ago, I still am a wrestling fan, but I have actually been involved with an American wrestling website as a feature writer. And I also did some freelance work for at least one magazine which is about to be deceased in this country. So I have a bit of history as far as the wrestling business goes, and as I say, I am a wrestling fan. So I kind of have to watch this film with two sets of eyes. One being a film fan and the other being a professional wrestling fan. Because unfortunately, there is no other way of doing this. So.
Absolutely. I saw this film in the cinema. My father-in-law and I went to see it, and we both greatly enjoyed it. And I think it is a film that is made for a cinema-going audience. It's not a film necessarily made for a wrestling audience.
You can say that again.
Yes, and as we were watching it together, there were a few moments where comments came from the sofa that Dan was sitting on regarding that. It's fair to say that I had to maybe convince you to watch this.
Yeah, I
had to engineer a situation where you would sit through it.
like a kind of soft form of extortion, you might say. And it wasn't that I doubted the credentials. I mean, the acting talent within the film is very, very good. I mean, Nick Frost is a lot of fun. Lena Headey is really good in it, and she seems much happier being returned to her more natural climate, which is being a bit gritty and really very potty-mouthed.
Yes.
But very happy doing it. I said to you, the Cersei Lannister was the exception, quite frankly. It's the thing that's really made her a star, but she is very down-to-earth, a proper British lass, and I'd say the acting talent within it, I can't fault it. Florence Pugh gives a good representation of the real Paige, whose real name is actually Soraya Jade Beavis. The Knight is the Knight family, that's what they're known as. But again, that's a wrestling moniker as well. But I digress. There's no doubting the overall caliber of actor within the film itself. There is just one problem for me, and that is that it is a complete and utter fairy tale. From a wrestling standpoint, it is not too many miles removed from a propaganda film. It is designed to perpetuate an illusion put forth by World Wrestling Entertainment that they are the only notion of professional wrestling that exists, that there is a linear system that is very black and white. This is all absolute nonsense. As you would expect with any film which is effectively a biopic, there are instances of truncation where you squeeze certain facts together, but there is taking liberties and there is taking the piss. And a lot of the representation of Paige's career trajectory and personal life, it's, as I say, it's a phenomenal load of nonsense in that regard. It's a strange thing, really, because watching this film, I found it to be extremely likable. And it's kind of a paradox, because you're watching a film and you think, I quite like this, but you know from the standpoint of being a wrestling fan that it's utter bollocks. And the way that it portrays the wrestling business, there's some interesting things in it, but sprinkling in a bit of wrestling vernacular, some of the parlance, and then kind of trying to marry that to this story, that doesn't lend it credibility. In fact, that's only going to annoy wrestling fans even more.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. I was just looking up the chap that played Zack Zodiac, Jack Loudon. For me, when I first saw it, just going back to the sort of performance aspect, a big part of the story is the fact that he was overlooked in favour of his sister.
Yes.
And from a dramatic standpoint, I feel that works very well.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And Jack Loudon is fantastic in the role. How much of that is part of the real
Not a great deal, as I said to you.
Yeah.
It's an entirely fraudulent construct. As I say, the impression you get from watching the film is that Paige is pretty much a well-trained but still a greenhorn, someone who's got no real experience, and then gets plucked from absolute obscurity to go to WWE via NXT, and the NXT is basically a little club where people get together and they do a few rolls in the ring and they practice promos, and that's kind of it. None of this is true. Paige was a very well-travelled and well-established performer, albeit young, but still with quite the impressive international resume before she was offered the opportunity to go to NXT and obviously to have a WWE trainee contract. The fact is that she already had a lot under her belt, and again in the film it gives you the sort of notion that it's just one of those things. She actually had 2 tryouts before, not one, as is depicted in the film. She had a couple of tryouts before she was actually accepted. And in NXT, she had a long and varied career, which was representative of the WWE product, just on a lower scale. A smaller scale might be a kind of way to put that. And she made a name for herself. She distinguished herself. And when she was called up to WWE, which is kind of the dramatic finale of this film, she was a lot more ready for it than the film would have you believe. As I say, it's incredibly sentimental and schmaltzy, and it tugs at the heartstrings, and it's very effective. If I didn't know the first damn thing about any aspect of this from the pro wrestling perspective, I would find this film to be sweet and sincere and entirely inoffensive. But being a wrestling fan and also knowing a bit about it beyond that, and knowing a little bit about Paige's life and, as I say, her career prior to, afterwards, and everything like that, far from being inoffensive, I find aspects of it entirely offensive. And I know that many other wrestling fans would think the same way. Now, this is where we have a bit of a quandary, because my own personal insight is what lends a certain subjectivity to my opinion here, to put it mildly.
Well, it's interesting because something that I would equate it to, for me, is my experience of watching Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah.
Because I am an avowed Queen fan, always have been all my life. Anyone who knows me with any, even for 5 minutes, will probably have gathered.
Well, I've always said Queen was your second religion.
That's right.
Yeah.
But in a way, you know, that there are many aspects of that. As you say, there has to be a certain amount of truncation in order for it to become
This is not unusual.
A 2-hour drama, you know, and there are many aspects of. I mean, I won't dwell on Bohemian Rhapsody too much, but there are many.
There will be plenty of time for that.
There will be, but there were many aspects of that caused friction with the Queen fandom because of the changing around of the timeline, and I suppose there's an element of that as well in sort of how are we going to make this a film that is palatable for a non-wrestling audience, which I think is really its main aim.
It is. This is the essential difference between a fictional motion picture and a documentary. Because if you wanted to tell the story of Soraya Knight, we'll use the Norwich dynasty or dynastic name. If you wanted to tell her story accurately, then or at least remotely accurately, you could do that through a documentary because you could have time to sort of dwell on it.
Which, of course, the film is based on.
Yes. But the story as depicted here is something that is a deliberate and very artificial construct, which is designed to provoke an emotional reaction, which obviously is what a film should do. It's a story that you can follow. It's a narrative. It's been structured in such a way as to affect you at key moments, which is why the point Tom was making about the way that the relationship with her brother is depicted within that film. It's designed to provide you with the maximum oomph for when you go for the heavy emotional moments within it. And that is understandable. And as I say to you, Fighting With My Family is far from the first film to do this. It's just, in my personal instance, I know a lot behind this, so obviously I'm equipped to call bullshit on quite a lot of it. But the other side of it, which again, sticking with the wrestling side of things, which is most grievous, is the manner in which it whitewashes the role of WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment, within this. There is no doubt that WWE has been for the longest time the largest entity. It is the big time. It's where you want to end up in terms of money and exposure. But the way that it represents the journey that a wrestler would stereotypically take to arrive there, the manner in which the rest of the business is portrayed, you are left with a distinct impression that there is nothing to it. And that is simply not true.
Going back to what you said, you know, Fighting With My Family is not the first film to portray this kind of rags to riches story.
Yeah.
I mean, it does follow the beats of a sports biopic almost to the letter, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
It's got the family background.
I think all it's missing is a proper montage.
Yes, absolutely. Even Rocky had a montage.
Yeah.
But
Infamously so.
yes, absolutely. Approaching it from that angle, it's maybe a superlative example of the form in terms of how well it's written and how well it's, Stephen Merchant, I think, admitted he is not a wrestling fan. I think that probably comes across in the film.
I think he does.
But I think
he lampoons it with his,
Yes, absolutely. But it's very much his style there, the sort of awkward comedy of the families meeting for the first time. So Zach, his girlfriend, comes from a very well-to-do family, and of course there is that sort of culture clash.
And they ask the question, the one that vexes everybody associated with business.
Coming.
Yeah. And that is, isn't wrestling fake, or is wrestling fake, as it were? And as I say to you, that is kind of the $64,000 question, the elephant in the room. But that idea of not aiming this in the direction of wrestling fans, I think, is correct. Because it's a story. I mean, firstly, WWE has always been insecure about being a wrestling company, for one thing. Always tried to move it away. That's why the emphasis is on entertainment. But to actually service a story which you can understand, it's smart to do it this way, because obviously it follows, like Tom says, it's basically beat for beat. It encompasses all those tropes that you expect from a film of this sort, and it does it very, very well. It's broad strokes, but it does it very, very well. You can't deny that. But this is where the attempt to rather casually slip in little bits of wrestling parlance, as I said earlier, and trying to make it almost ironically enough a wink, wink, nod, nod exercise, that is not actually really going to help. It's a desperate attempt to sprinkle a little credibility, a bit of verisimilitude on it. Yeah, and it's actually more annoying because of it. Because it does it in such a blasé way. Like, oh, well, we all know anyway. And it's like, well, we don't. And the way you're using it, it's borderline offensive. So that is why watching this film for me is an interesting experience. Because as I said to you, if I didn't know the first damn thing about professional wrestling, I would have found this to be an interesting experience and an enjoyable film. And I probably would have gained something from it. And I suppose you could make that soft argument that what you do see about the business, you do learn a little bit about it, but you don't really get much from it. I mean, you could also argue that it does show respect for the preparation for professional wrestling, in terms of obviously the physical toll that it takes. But it's just too confused in that regard. So it comes down to really straightforwardly, if you know something about wrestling, this film is probably going to annoy you a lot. But if you don't, then there's a lot here to commend it.
Yeah, I agree with that, Dan. I think there is a lot to commend it. When it came out, there was a lot of buzz about it, actually. I remember talking to you, and you were saying that on the sort of wrestling channels and things, there was a lot of promotion to push the film.
Oh, God, yes. If I had a fiver for every time I saw Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and I love the Great One. Don't get me wrong, it's never anything other than a pleasure to see him. But if I had a fiver for every time I saw that part of the trailer or him cutting that promo, I'd be a very wealthy man.
Yeah. And I think that's it. I mean, I think it's a stroke of marketing genius to have The Rock involved in this, to have Dwayne Johnson involved in this.
Yeah.
I mean, amusingly, in the end credits, it says, Dwayne Johnson has gone on to a career outside of wrestling, a very sort of...
That's a very humble way of describing the man who is now the confirmed greatest and most successful box office drawer in Hollywood right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to have him involved in the film...
It's a boon.
It's a boon.
Yeah.
And his performance is very, very entertaining. He is a very likeable screen presence in all that he does. I think he has done very well for himself in the last 20 years.
As the old saying goes, charisma to spare.
Well, that's it, in abundance. So, he's only in it, I don't know, a culmination of about 15 minutes in the whole film, but it works. His interaction with Florence Pugh is lovely. His the conversation he has with Nick Frost over the phone, I think, is a comedic
That's
highlight.
Hilarious, absolutely hilarious.
And it must be said, as you've mentioned, Nick Frost is brilliant as the head of the family. He's proud of his offspring. He's proud of their sort of somewhat kind of regional wrestling fraternity. He loves his family, and that comes across. And I think there is a real heart to the film, and I think that's one of the reasons why I liked it. Because I wanted to see it because it looked entertaining. I enjoyed the trailers.
I will admit I was surprised when because as I said to me, having anything to do with wrestling, it kind of speaks immediately to a more niche interest. And I was surprised initially when you told me that you were that curious about it. But nonetheless,
But there we go, and that's the thing. It's another example of there is a universal appeal, I think, because it is that sort of. I say rags to riches. I mean that in the sort of very generic sense, but it is that story of someone succeeding and
Yeah,
of
it's
someone
from very little to a lot.
to a lot. And I
Yeah.
think that is a theme that will resonate with people. It's funny. I mean, it's very well written. I mean,
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
you mentioned that on
Some of
while we were
the
watching.
lines, and also in terms of the kind of colloquial quality, the fact that obviously they're very much wanting to emphasise the Norwich side of it.
Fish out of water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only an Englishman could have written that, could have got the sense of humour, because obviously a lot of it is very much British humour, and the willingness to kind of poke fun at Norwich, which admittedly is a fairly easy thing to do. No offence. But it is something that's there, and it's done very, very well. It's very sharp. Some of the asides, the swearing, the little uses of the language are eye-wateringly funny, and it's one of the film's undeniable strengths, regardless of the whole wrestling yay, wrestling nay thing. It is very well written.
Yeah. For me, I would recommend the film. I think it's, as we've said, it's funny, it's heartwarming, it's very British. It does a brilliant job of, as I say, that fish out of water story of someone who, at least dramatically within the narrative, is someone who is made to look a little bit out of their depth, even if that was not the.
Oh,
the
there was
real
definitely
story.
an unusual aspect to Paige's sort of heritage and her being British. I mean, obviously the wrestling in general, but WWE in particular, has a very strong time-tested association with the UK, and it wasn't altogether unusual in that regard. But obviously, a British female wrestler was not altogether usual. And the success that she had, the way that she was elevated so rapidly, it was something sort of something unconventional at the time. But the point is that from a wrestling standpoint, she was a lot more ready for it than this film would have you believe. But then this film would be infinitely less dramatic if it went with the truth of it.
So, in summary then,
Yeah.
would you recommend the film?
I actually would. I think that if you're looking for something which is enjoyable, which is funny, which is a bit esoteric in terms of the subject matter, even if we're talking just about the surface detail, yes, I would. From a pure standpoint of talking about just a film, yeah, I would. However, if you are a delicate little pro wrestling flower, you might be somewhat offended by aspects of it, certainly annoyed, maybe offensive is a little bit strong, but the accuracy vis-a-vis the professional wrestling business is not really there, and it warps and distorts and simplifies and takes liberties, and it's not ideal. So it really does come down, for me anyway, it comes down to a simple binary reality. If you are a professional wrestling fan, it's very definitely a nay. If you are not, and you're everything or anything else, and let's face it, most people probably are in this latter category, then it is a fairly comfortable yay.
Thank you for listening, and we will be back with another Janus Film Review podcast in the near future, I am sure.
Until then, boys and girls, toodaloo.
Toodaloo.